Have you noticed modern cities are increasingly becoming more and more alike, sterile, and to be honest, ugly? Go anywhere in the world and you'll see similar dystopian-like buildings. And I get it, some of you might like this, but do you like this? What about this? And do you like this more than this? Many of the modern buildings today have an average lifespan of 50 to 60 years. Yet, a lot of the classical architecture that seems to be so expensive and time-consuming and difficult to build seems to have been built to last. And everyone wants to preserve it. No one, and I mean no one, wants to preserve this or this. Why? Is it functionality that is lacking in these buildings? Or is it something else? Something more intangible or often disregarded by modern thinkers. You know, beauty. But what is beauty though? I was taught by the culture and society that beauty is subjective, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, que para gustos y colores no han escrito los autores. Essentially, that anyone can find anything beautiful. Let's be real for 1 second. There is such thing as objective beauty. There are things which most people find and agree that are beautiful. You don't see people congregating equally around the world and around cities around the world to take photos of things to save to their phones or post to their Instagrams. They usually go to specific spots in cities and specific countries. It may be true that there is such a thing as subjective beauty, something that an individual finds beautiful because of their own feelings and emotions around it. There are things which some people find dreadful and some people find beautiful. Winter, for example. I find it beautiful. My husband does not. And I find the glittering snow magical. I find the streets and homes and cities and towns covered in snow enchanting. And the cold air makes me feel alive. I also have good memories associated with snow and winter. As a little girl, I often traveled to wintry places for Christmas to spend time skiing with my family, and I learned to ski at 6 years old. They were magical times, and I still yearn for skiing. And after I lived in Switzerland and in Boston and New York, braving the winter for 4+ months, which is very different than going for a vacation, I never stopped loving winter. Some will agree with me, and some will not. And this might be an example of subjective beauty. But the reality is that there are places that most of us agree are beautiful. A sunny afternoon in the beaches of Positano, a stroll along the Champs-Élysées in Paris, having a Bellini while looking at the Grand Canal in Venice, skiing down the slopes of the Swiss Alps and seeing the Matterhorn. These things are beautiful. And there is a reason people go to these places and not Roswell, New Mexico, or Detroit, or the outskirts of Philadelphia. There might be other reasons people go to these places, but certainly not for the aesthetics. Traditionally, beauty was viewed as one of the ultimate values. Among goodness, truth, and justice, beauty was a primary theme among Greek, Hellenistic, and medieval philosophers. But something changed in the 20th century, and there's a decline in philosophical inquiry for beauty and as a primary goal in the arts. The classical conception of beauty was that it had to consist of harmony, that it had to be a coherent whole, that it had to be proportionate, and that it had to have some symmetry. Classical buildings represent this well. But then this happened. while researching this video, I watched a lot of architecture videos. And thankfully, I found quite a bit of YouTubers that criticize modern architecture. I'm not an architect myself, so I had to rely on a bit of their expertise. I found that in architecture schools, there's a push for individual creative expression over harmony and true beauty. Well, beauty is subjective, as we are told to believe. I found that there was a poll conducted in a school, which I will share the link below. And the poll interviewed architecture students and non-architecture students, and the results were very interesting. Quote, "The task discriminated very clearly between the two groups of students. Architects showed a strong tendency to prefer the more complex and asymmetrical designs, while non-architects and the general population showed the reverse preference," unquote. Quote, "The divergence of the preference of the architectural students from the norm became more marked the longer they had been studying architecture. The difference between first-year architects and the norm was relatively small, though still significant, but became markedly stronger among later year students," unquote. Quote, "This result suggests that the normal training of architects fosters the development of divergent aesthetic preferences." Yeah, they are being trained to like ugly things. But really, essentially, the people that are designing our spaces differ radically in taste than the people who are living around such spaces. Their tastes are different than the general population, which has to endure their monstrous designs. And that the longer they were in architecture school, the more their tastes differed from that of most people. Is it because most people are unrefined? I don't think so. I think if you have to be trained and indoctrinated into liking something and thinking it is pleasant or beautiful, it's because it's really not. Modern architecture quite literally goes against our own human sensibilities and perception of beauty, and they will laugh at you and think you're unrefined if you don't like their unsightly creations. Again, I'm not an architect, so I had to take in information from others, but modern architecture's main tenets, or what some call modernism, are that form should follow function, that there should be a rejection of ornament, and that design should be minimalist. The less cynical or sinister view of how modern architecture came to be so popular is that it was simply cheaper to build. After the war, there was a housing crisis, and things like the commie block solved that, because housing could be built cheaply and relatively fast, because many of these buildings use standardized materials. The other aspects of this is cars, and how cities were beginning to shape themselves around the car traffic rather than foot traffic. And some would argue, what good is a beautiful city if no one will see it, only fast-passing vehicles? And quite frankly, I don't think this is a good excuse to destroy beautiful and walkable cities, but that's my view. And also, if we're totally honest, a lot of these designs do not follow function and are built asymmetrically and in very strange and chaotic forms. That seems to be the evolution of complete creative expression that departs from classical architecture. Now, I want to get into Bauhaus. Bauhaus is key to the modern architecture movement. Some say that first came Bauhaus and then came the international style, which we all know and loathe. And of course, we have modernism, which encompasses many ugly styles. So the Bauhaus was a German art school founded during the Weimar Republic by Walter Gropius, a German man of Jewish roots who later went to head the Harvard School architecture department. So at the Bauhaus, there was this vibe there was a bit of an ideological undercurrent to what was being taught. Everything about the Bauhaus was a promise to reduce to functionality and abandon ornament or anything which was not considered useful. The school wanted to reinvent the material world. It wanted to revolutionize our physical reality in a way which would in turn would usher in some sort of progressive utopia. In fact, many of the students were known to go into the towns and throw red paint on German statues and art. Do our cities shape us, or do we shape our cities? Perhaps the Bauhaus students and teachers thought that a city could shape the people. Bauhaus, created in Weimar during those ultra-progressive years, rejected traditionalism entirely. Art students before Bauhaus were expected to follow the guidelines of classical beauty, which included harmony and symmetry. And they were expected to understand the human form and, in some sense, follow realism. Well, not a Bauhaus. Remember, we are starting anew. We are erasing the old rules. We are revolutionizing. A Bauhaus painting something too close to tradition or realism was a bad thing. It would probably be taken as lacking in creativity and in failure. The school's mission and reputation ended up attracting a lot of left-leaning and openly communist students, as well as teachers, many of them communists. The whole vibe of the school was anti-bourgeoisie, and the classical architecture was seen as bourgeoisie. Ornaments were bourgeoisie and complex designs as well. Reject that. At least that was the view. Side notes, many students rejected gender norms and men dressed as women, but mostly this drive was to be androgynous. Finally, the Nazis. They came in and kicked the Bauhaus style. I guess they were unsophisticated because they did not appreciate the Bauhaus art and they favored more of a German style architecture. Remember, honoring local traditions in European nations is bad. And so if you do that, you are just like the Nazis. So the students left Germany and the Bauhaus unfortunately spread. And because many of the students were Jewish, Bauhaus became a staple of places like Tel Aviv. Eventually, Bauhaus became known as the international style. That style which blends countries together so that there is no distinguishing factor. The globalist preferred style. And the theory is that because of the whole story relating to the end of the war, many companies did not want to associate with nationalism and therefore adopted the international style, as nationalism had become the scapegoat for the wars rather than economic interests. Architects then that still appreciated the classical architecture and wanted to build such things now had a steep hill to climb, as many of them were mocked as backwards and archaic. Honestly, it's like we are in a perpetual race to the bottom. The idea of the Bauhaus was to remove culture and start over. Create a blank canvas and then all cultures would be the same. What a paradise. And maybe then we would have our world peace and utopia and just everything would be the same everywhere in the world. Amazing, right? Destroy all traditions and usher in a truly progressive world. Now, I'll do a quick contrast because this is not exactly a school like the Bauhaus, but let's look at Paris, the City of Lights, one of the most visited cities in the world, if not the most. Why is this? Is it because people want to hear French? Perhaps. Or is it maybe because of the beauty of the culture the food, and without a doubt, the fact that it's a beautiful city, if mass immigration hasn't destroyed it yet, of course. Haussmann architecture takes the name of Baron George Eugene Haussmann, a Parisian official who revamped the city at the request of Emperor Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. Haussmann assumed this huge task and decided to eliminate 12,000 medieval structures during a time when Paris was not Paris. It was a filthy city filled with maze-like streets. Many people lived on top of each other in dirty conditions. The city was overcrowded and infested with disease. And somehow, Haussmann changed this. And his new construction was not all about function and practicality, but also beauty. He redesigned the city with wide, state-like boulevards, built 40,000 new buildings. He lined the streets with graceful avenues and made it possible for there to be lights in the city. And it came to be known as the City of Light. Many people of noble birth in comfortable positions were moving into the Haussmann buildings that were very elegantly made, and the city flourished. And today, his legacy accounts for 60% of Parisian architecture. And the Haussmann buildings are still very prized pieces of architecture. And although this represented a sort of gentrification at the time, it created the work of art that Paris is today. So you see, beauty does have a function. We want to be aesthetically pleased. We want to preserve beautiful things. People will pay more to live in beautiful places. It has been proven that beautiful places and a pleasant living environment will help with mental well-being. And yet, we insist on building gray blocks for profit. Creating a feeling has a function. Movie makers know this. Marketers know this. Even restaurateurs know this, and many others. So why can't we have this nice feelings created in our cities where we live? And no, what we find beautiful is not culturally conditioned for the most part. Shakespeare, for example, is translated into every major language on earth. The Japanese love Beethoven. We all recognize beautiful scenery. Walk around any major European city or Asian city and its beautiful monuments, and you will find all languages being spoken by people traveling from everywhere around the world to see these beauties. In a TED Talk about beauty and the Darwinian theory about beauty, which I will link in the description, Dennis Dutton explains how our attraction to beauty is part of our human experience and that it is adaptive. He says, quote, "Beauty is nature's way of acting at a distance." I am hopeful for the future though, as many people are starting to notice this and talk about it. And in many cities, there have been efforts undertaken to restore beautiful architecture. And let's hope this continues. With that, I end this video. See you next week. Let me know what you think in the comments.